Welcome to Enlightened Omnivore, the monthly podcast that serves up a delicious mix of food, sustainability, and travel. I'm your host, Steve Sabaker, here to explore the wonders of mindful eating. Get ready to expand your palate and your mind, one bite at a time. Welcome back to Enlightened Omnivore. Between the pastoral scenes of cattle grazing on green fields and those perfectly wrapped packages in your grocery store, there is a mysterious world behind windowless walls, the slaughterhouse. My guest today, David Zarling, has spent his career in these buildings working to make our food system both more humane and more efficient. As a veteran of the meatpacking industry, David is focused on what he calls the meat of the middle, helping conscientious producers bridge the gap between industrial megaplants and small artisanal operations. His perspective on transparency, sustainability, and the future of meat processing in our country is shaped by years of hands-on experience. And David isn't afraid to confront hard realities, but he also hasn't lost his vision for positive change. Whether you're a consumer wondering about your meat's farm-to-table journey, or a professional trying to navigate the intricacies of the industry, today's conversation promises to shed light on one of the most important and least discussed links in our food system. Let's get enlightened. Hey, thanks for being here, David. Welcome to the Enlightened Omnivore podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me, Steve. It's really good to be with you this morning. It's been a long time.
David, you work in the side of the meat industry that happens a lot behind closed doors. And I'm really excited to have you on today because I feel like we're going to get to talk about some things that folks have a lot of questions about, but they never really get to see. And someone like you with your experience and your commitment to small and family operated operations, I think we've got, a lot of exciting conversation in store. You've been teaching and preaching about these smaller scale facilities that do processing and slaughter, and they have huge benefit to our food system, but I bet people don't really know what the difference is between a meat processing facility and a slaughterhouse. Could you give us a little bit of an overview of what you've been up to the last, decade or more?
Sure. Yeah. Let's see. Yeah, great question. I guess over the last decade, my personal mission has really been to dive into the darkest corners of the industry and figure out, first of all, what's there, what the belief systems are that drive them, what economic factors and social factors drive them, and how we can kind of optimize them. I'm a person that I'm a very black and white thinker. And so I love problem solving more than anything else. And I can't think of an industry that is more closely associated with problem solving than small meat processing, to be honest. So, I started a little over, I don't know, I guess, where was I a decade ago? A decade ago, I was managing a USDA inspected mobile slaughter unit in Northwestern Washington for 100% grass-fed organic beef brands, and they just had absolutely beautiful beef, but had at the time I was very, very focused on butchery skills, humane slaughter, super efficient processing, figuring out how to maximize margins, strictly looking at the cut shop itself, and learning about building brands. I mean, the super neat kind of, I would almost say, hobby farmer or very small herd industry was kind of exploding then, and there was a lot of opportunity, but a lot of unknowns. And I think, thanks to Mr. Salatin, who's going to have what appears to be a pretty big role in the upcoming administration.
Right? How crazy is that? Can you tell Joel Salatin, who is kind of one of the godfathers of regenerative agriculture, and more recently, maybe got a little bit canceled by some folks in the space, but he's now being pegged for a role in the USDA?
Yeah, it seems like he'll have some sort of advisory role as it pertains to, I'm actually not really sure.
Right. I don't think any of us are. There's not.
Yeah,
I don't really talk politics on this podcast, but it's fascinating to see someone of his
Yeah.
perspective on in a government agency. I'm just kind of blown away. I mean, that regenerative agriculture's really made it if that's the case, because there's nothing commodity about his perspective on the industry. I mean, to talk about a totally different perspective. But anyway, so what is your relationship with him, and how did he influence your path?
That's a great question. Joel actually, like probably many of us, who are probably, 30 to 45 or 50 years of age, were really inspired by him.
Yeah.
Joel, if he's not a great motivator and salesperson, he's nothing. And he really told a fantastic story about what could be, and he exploited a lot of the challenges and the barriers to entry and the nonsensical parts of small ag. And, really, I think you could say he forged a bit of a path. I mean, there's lots of other people that were doing this, and I don't want to take away credit from anybody else, but he was the most assertive voice. He found a way to be heard.
Absolutely.
And of course, Michael Pollan really had a lot to do with that in his book, The Omnivore's Dilemma. But Joel, I think he told a story back then that was really timely, and I think spoke to different people for different reasons. To me, it spoke about resistance and autonomy and changing the rules of the game.
Yeah.
And I think that now that what he inspired a whole generation of small farmers to do is being looked at through a different lens. Now it's kind of like, okay, great, Joel, awesome, great message. Now how do we make this work?
Right. I mean, getting regenerative agriculture to scale is something that I mean, we could talk all day about that. But I brought up too, Michael Pollan. Like, how influential was Omnivore's Dilemma to you?
I mean, actually, the book that that was a huge book for me. But my entry to him was the Botany of Desire.
Oh wow, okay, yeah,
Which I found to be an interesting book. I really appreciated the perspective that perhaps plants and livestock are actually domesticating us to help preserve their genome. And what's really hard to argue with, I think it's a fantastic perspective, and it's a really big picture perspective, and that was a huge book that kind of unlocked some critical thinking skills in me.
I've been like infatuated with mushrooms for the last 6 months, and I have to bring up mushrooms in every single conversation now. But this guy William Padilla Brown, who's an influencer sensation on all things mycelium, he talks about that too. Where I think he's even got a satchel he carries around where it says, mushrooms have colonized the earth, and there's a lot of folks are speculating now that they're actually extraterrestrials that came here, at the molecular level, and then now are running the roost in terms of everything from soil health to, neurological function. I mean, it's kind of crazy where all of these botanics are intimately involved in our ecosystem, and we kind of think of them as secondary. Let's talk about the life cycle of meat production in the US, because I think that would be a good benchmark for listeners. We've seen the animals out in the field. We know that they end up sometimes in feedlots. They then go to a processing facility, most of those in the Midwest, and then they end up as, chunks of meat that get broken down by butchers or meat cutters in our grocery store and wrapped in plastic. What is the process in your mind, and where are the areas that you've been most involved in your career?
Let's see. So I suppose we take the technical process, leaving out the different reasons why someone gets into the business. And let's say we take beef. We could take grass-fed beef.
That's a good start.
Sure. So, you're a rancher. You've got a cow-calf operation, which is maybe a little bit less common than a feeder operation. So you got the two kinds. You're either, calving on farm, or you're purchasing calves at some age, whether it's, just a weaner, a very young calf, or an older calf that just needs to be finished, depending on what your operation looks like. And when I say finishing, I mean um, taking a healthy, strong, of age animal and feeding them a diet that promotes heavy muscle gain as well as fat marbling. So it's kind of like, in a sense, I'm being finished right now because it's the holiday season and I'm coming off of my summer fitness physique and moving directly into stuffing and cookies. And so I'll be ready for market come like January 1st,
There we go.
So, so you've got a cow calf operation. We're calving, and if it's a grass fed beef, these animals are going to be fed on a ration until they're 24 to 32 months of age. So, that rancher's got 2 to 2.5, almost 3 years of feeding and managing this animal before they get to go to the slaughterhouse. So, just for people that don't know how much work and how tremendously resource intensive it is, 2 to 3 years to raise something before you see any sort of return is incredible. And so from there, a small rancher, somebody that probably is harvesting less than 100 head a year, is looking for a local processing plant, and they're going to send that animal there. They're going to be harvested. They're going to be cut. They're going to be wrapped. And then it's going to be shipped back to the farmer, and then they're going to sell it in whatever way they're going to sell it. Could be direct to consumer, could be e-commerce in 2024. Everybody's got an online store. Could be a small regional grocery chain or what have you, but it's like this exchange of materials between people, and costs are added during every step. And then the end user faces all of those costs plus probably a razor thin margin.
Absolutely, yeah. So after the farmer has raised this animal to the weight where they can make a profit, or sometimes they just have to hold a herd, but they send it on to be harvested, is the word you use, which is the word we would use at the butcher shop too. This is a slaughterhouse. What is a slaughterhouse like? I mean, we're not going to be graphic today for my audience, but give us a sense of like, okay, that animal shows up on a truck, and then what is the experience?
Sure. Yeah, I appreciate you pointing that out. Harvest is something that I say when I'm talking at conferences or teaching at OSU or whatever. But in the industry, we say kill, and because that's not a violent thing for us. It's just a black and white word, and it's very utilitarian, but it's not without reverence. It's just, that's what we say. So, what's a slaughterhouse like? You've got a couple of different, I guess I'll start really, really black and white. You've got a couple of different models. You've got what we call kill and chill facilities, which is a little bit more common now than it was when we first met. This is a slaughterhouse where animals come in, they're harvested, they're dressed, and dressed is, they're sanitarily, deconstructed to be just a clean carcass. And from there, those animals are chilled down very quickly to be compliant with food safety protocol, and then they're shipped out as a carcass to butcher shops like Electric City Butcher, right? A place where you're going to take in a quarter and you're going to fabricate it in whatever way works for you. And those tend to be a higher volume plant because there's much lower margin on slaughter. But if you have the volume, it works. And then there's, what we're more used to, which would be, you've got the cut and wrap. A cut and wrap facility is where people have been taking their beef and hogs for the last 100 years. It's a small facility. They slaughter, they fabricate into raw cuts, they grind, and then they oftentimes have a further processing offering.
Bacon or sausage or
pretty basic. Bacon, ham, sausage,
yeah,
generally speaking. Some of the more intrepid ones will make you a snack stick or jerky or something.
Or charcuterie.
Or charcuterie, and those cut and wraps don't last very long because those margins are super thin, which we could
Tough
talk about at
business.
some point. But
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
and then then you've got the more specialized places where you might have a larger facility that will kill and fabricate, but then they send those pieces on to more specialized facilities, and so I used to manage a plant like that in Wenatchee, Washington, where we would get raw materials from a slaughterhouse, raw materials being pork shoulders, legs, trim, boneless meat, and then we would fabricate that into everything under the sun: snack sticks, old world, dry cured salami, prosciutto, culotta, you name it.
Yeah, and this is kind of a rebirth of an industry that has gone through a lot of changes. I think a lot of people assume that that's the model across the country, or at least at that scale, that it's farmers with hundreds of animals that are then sending their animals to slaughter, and then they're processed and cut and wrap, and then the carcass is sent somewhere else. But that's only what, 5% of the market? Isn't the majority of the volume like at these larger facilities in the middle of the country? The JB, what is it? The
JBS,
uh,
sure, yeah, Cargill, JBS. Tyson has its own plants. Yes, absolutely. I mean, we could spend 3 hours just talking about the economics of the beef industry,
yeah, I mean,
and
this is so
maybe
different.
will sometime, but yes, to your point, to feed the country, we have these facilities that are often like really demonized for some well-earned reasons and some mythical reasons, that make our country go round. And yes, you're right. I would say that, I think that the ratio has changed since the pandemic. We're, one of our missions at OSU, the Niche Meat Processor Assistance Network, is to help build and support what we call the meat of the middle, and that's the mid-size supply chain. So, when gosh, we're all so sick of talking about COVID, but it was just such a great eye opener, if you want it to be. And, it kind of showed us what happens when the supply chain is centralized and takes a hit. There isn't really redundancy built in. And then we see what happens in that exact same scenario where you've got these tiny plants who they can't keep up, And so we're looking at building the middle of the supply chain so that we can kind of redistribute that ratio so there's a bit of redundancy, so that, regional supply chains can thrive, where people can get access to great meat at a reasonable price, maybe not Walmart price, but maybe not also $63.99 a pound ribeyes at the farmer's market price. We're trying to build that more flexible, resilient, mid-sized supply chain.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I think it was surprising during COVID when people saw the supply chain come to a screeching halt, because it really was just a handful of really large facilities that had a lot of people in them, and they didn't know exactly how to manage COVID at that time. So when things stopped, people saw shortages, even though there was plenty of food in the system. And the irony was our little operation, which was doing thousands of pounds of meat a month, was not impacted by COVID because we were working directly with these smaller producers you're talking about. So I feel like that resiliency you're talking about is a diversity of the system. So we're not reliant on a handful of producers or physical buildings even. We're relying on a more regional system that has big producers so that they can create that $3 a pound ground beef, and smaller facilities that can service the ranchers who only have a couple hundred cattle. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's really easy to idealize food and romanticize it and kind of demonize the big supply chains and the low prices at the grocery store. But at the end of the day, and gosh, we could talk about wage disparity and distribution in the U.S. for a very long time, and how that impacts our perceived value of food and what we're willing to pay and such. But I think the more that we're able to develop relationships and adopt some of those manufacturing and accounting practices from those large brands. I mean, they're not big because they're villains. They're big because they figured out how to make it work. And the demand kept growing, so they kept rising to meet the demand. I mean, Purdue Family Farms was small at one point, and so yeah, I think that building up that mid-sized chain is going to give us that sort of flexibility when this sort of thing happens in the future, because it will. It might not always be a biological threat. It could be a political threat. It could be, a climate threat. There's so many things, right? Like we're facing a drought in the West that's not been seen before. They've got wildfires ravaging the East Coast, which is just like bizarro world, And so, I think that having that sort of redundancy in the system is just going to make us a happier, healthier, more secure and confident customer base nationwide.
Absolutely. So tell me what a day in the life of a processor looks like. We've all seen the pictures, and I'll have some up in the article for this podcast of these big white box buildings. They've got no windows, and you pull into a parking lot, you see guys drive in, maybe they walk in with a white jacket on, you suit up and you start your day. What's going on past that door?
A day in the life is we show up and we've got one person that's in charge of the slaughter crew, and they're out checking animals and working with the USDA. Prior to slaughter, we do what's called an antemortem inspection, where the USDA walks the pens and they check every animal and they make sure that nobody's lame and nobody can't, is laying down and non-ambulatory, as we call it. Or like if you're a beef that can't walk, you're not eligible for slaughter. And there's a reason for that.
And when you say USDA, you mean there's an inspector on site all day long?
Yeah, great question. So when you slaughter, there is always an inspector there the entire time. You cannot kill without an inspector. And there's lots of reasons for that. Partially that antemortem inspection to make sure that everything that you're bringing through the plant is wholesome and healthy, and we're not bringing through animals that are riddled with cancer and, could potentially have mad cow disease. I mean, they're there to be that buffer, because the American public has said, we want the government to ensure that when I walk into a restaurant, we can trust it. Thanks, Jack in the Box.
That's the E. coli.
Well, yeah. I mean, you could order exactly
20 years ago.
You could order a medium rare or a rare burger at Jack in the Box in 1990, and that allowing the consumer to make that choice was the impetus for all of the regulation we have now. The Federal Meat Inspection Act that rolled out in 96. Existed mainly because of all of that whole mess,
Yeah, I remember that. I think I remember my stepmother picking through my brother's burgers to make sure there was no pink. Morgan could not eat a hamburger intact for 10 years after that. So,
yeah.
Okay, so you enter the facility. You guys have a team. How many animals are you processing for a small scale facility like that? And just again, for readers or for listeners' perspective, like some of these facilities can have 12 or 1,500 employees, right? I mean, the big ones can be thousands of employees. We're talking about the other end of the space where it's, a couple dozen. So what happens, your team gets together. How many animals are you guys processing in a day?
Yeah, I mean, I could take the plant that I manage right now. So I have a crew of roughly 25, and eventually that'll probably double because we'll be slaughtering every day, but fabricating every day. But generally speaking, in a startup plant, you're building clientele, you're building business. And so you're having the same people kill as process, throughout the week as you grow. This plant is built to be able to kill between 40 and 60 a day. Right now, we probably do about 30 head a day, once or twice a week. And then we fabricate the rest of the week. So I would say, depending on the setup, now there's so many different configurations that are more or less efficient on a kill floor. But generally speaking, I consider my benchmark to be a plant that I managed in Michigan, and we had a crew of 5 people on the slaughter floor. We could very comfortably kill about 20 to 25 head a day with those 5 people.
So that's less than 30 minutes per animal.
Mm-hmm.
That you can process pretty quickly.
Yep.
And what would surprise people most about the process?
The first thing is how much work FSIS really does. Now, I understand I've had the benefit of being on the West Coast, the West Coast or the Great Lakes region, the majority of my career. I spent a lot of time in the East. Don't think that all inspection circuits are created equal, just as any business, any large organization is. But I would say the most surprising things are the amount of work that they do there. So, FSIS, the American people in the early 90s demanded that when they walk into a restaurant or a grocery store, that their food is wholesome, that they could trust it, they could spend their hard-earned dollars and walk out with something that they can trust. You don't have to wash your chicken in the sink anymore. In fact, don't do that.
You heard it here on Enlightened Omnivore. You don't need to wash your chicken for salmonella. You're talking about.
Yeah, salmonella or Campylobacter, like neither of those things are really, they're not really prevalent. And if there is just a tiny colony of those things on your meat, you're going to cook it out. Don't spread it around your kitchen. And I know that that's a cultural thing, so no offense to anybody.
So why does the USDA still advocate for like high temperature cooking of pork and rinsing your chicken and all of these things? That what you're saying is that these new legislation that came out in the 90s, these new regulations kind of eradicated or did away with. Why is the USDA still telling us to cook our pork to 160 degrees when there hasn't been a trichinosis outbreak in 50 years?
That's a good question. Yeah, I think that was about to go away, and then pastured pork happened. And so, pastured pork, like, don't get me wrong, that's what I want. I want an animal that's been out in the woods, rooting around for mushrooms and just eating whatever it wants, a healthy, fat, muscular, active animal. I want that. I like that.
Me too.
Yeah. However, there are risks that come with it, right? Like sure, yeah, if you've got an animal that's living its entire life on concrete, and that they're moved out once a day, that concrete is hosed down and cleaned and sanitized, and then brought back into their concrete, sure, there's no worms in there, there's no parasites, there's no pathogens, it's absolutely sterile. You could, after that rinse down, eat off of that concrete floor.
No, thank you.
But no thanks. But it's like, it's not natural. Just like if you lived or if I lived in an environment like that, we would inherently, like, while it would be sterile, would our bodies be healthy? Probably not, right?
Not a great immune system, probably.
Yeah, not a good immune system at all. Yeah, totally, exactly. But there are certain risks. So, we got a lot of interest in charcuterie, in old world techniques, and a lot of chefs are pushing the envelope of what we would consider to be undercooked meat. And so the USDA still, as a CYA policy, has these safe handling instructions. Is it an overstep? Yeah, probably.
Yeah, and we could talk about the different cooking methods, certainly intact versus non-intact, which just means, steaks versus ground meat. There's all kinds of different challenges there. And I've even heard folks talk about Costco and their blade steaks, where they're microblading the steaks for tenderizing, and that introduces bacteria. And so there's a lot of variabilities, which makes sense why the USDA might be conservative. So then, does the USDA, do those rules really keep our food safe, or is this just a bureaucratic mess that's keeping small businesses from getting involved in the food system?
I love this question. This is a very, very good, rich question. And yeah, I love it. And I would say that I do not claim to have the best answer. There are other people, like, this is a panel question. Like, if you take me and Denise Perry former plant manager of Lawrence Meats, current associate professor at the Humane Handling Institute and University of Wisconsin River Falls. She's also an absolute guru when it comes to humane handling and QC. If you took Denise Perry, me, Greg Gunthorpe of Gunthorpe Family Farms in the Midwest, Lauren Poncha from Stemple Creek Beef, if you took a panel of us, the answer would be totally different for everybody, and it would all be right.
So, well, first of all, we should do that panel. Let's find a conference that wants to do that.
Yeah.
I'll happily moderate. So give me a couple of those perspectives. I mean,
Sure.
I think a lot of folks are scratching their head right now. Wait, USDA, you just said the USDA has done a ton to make food safe for folks after these scares in the 90s. And I'm saying that a lot of these larger plants, I've written about this, that they really don't have the scrutiny because of the velocity of animals that are coming through the process. It's hard to control when you're slaughtering 1,000 animals an hour than when you're doing 15 or 20 in a facility like the one you work in. Where is the balance? And then I'll go even further and say, when we tried to open a facility, and full disclosure, David was our consultant on this project here in Southern California. We tried to open a facility, convert an existing facility that was grandfathered in, and the number of hoops and the amount of things you have to buy and make sure that there's a parking spot for the inspector and a certain coffee maker and all these other obligations, it makes it really hard for a small operation to make that pencil out. So give me kind of your perspective. I gave you mine, but why do you think that everyone could answer that question differently?
I think at the end of the day, it depends on cost. And from the time that I was a consultant for you, at the time, I was, very altruistic, all about the process, could tell you what to do in the plant the right way to give you them the highest quality. Today, I'm different. Today, I'm a different person. Today, my world revolves around cost and manufacturing principle and whether or not we should do something because it may or may not be financially viable. So my personal education and drive for knowledge has led me in the direction of accounting and financial hygiene.
I love that term, financial hygiene. I think I know where you're going with this, but I feel like a lot of folks who started out in the artisanal butchery business in the early 2010, it was more art than science. And we were super excited to be returning to this traditional romantic approach to the business. And we worked super hard.
So hard.
Super hard, like harder than anybody can imagine. If you think
Oh, yes.
what your day is like, anybody out there, imagine it's twice as hard, and then you never sleep. And people were losing their minds. And my friend Heather Thomason, who's been on the show, and we both write on Substack a lot together, we kind of commiserate. There's this PTSD from the experience. So I think I know what fiscal hygiene might have to do with, but tell me, like, specifically how that's changed the way you see processing. Like,
the fiscal hygiene. I mean, I think that, gosh, this is a tough one because there's so much to say. I think that there was and this brings us back to Joel. There was so much enthusiasm in the early 2000s about generate $150,000 on your 3 acres, in all of the offshoots of hobby to lifestyle farming and how profitable it can be and how purpose-driven it is. And there are a lot of people that are very good at producing very high-quality product that have no accounting background or financial background or business background, but you have to have that piece. And it's not fun. It's not sexy. It's not interesting. It's not, cute or bespoke or any of those things. But when I go into job interviews now, I have 2 conditions. And one of them is we have to have a CFO or a controller. We have to have one. If we don't have one, it's never going to work. Doesn't matter how good we are. Doesn't matter how good the product is. Doesn't matter how good I am at running a plant. Without the financial mind to model out, give you the data, and look back at it to make decisions from, there's just no conversation.
We tried to do that early on at Electric City Butcher, but there's a lot of folks who have really struggled because financially they just didn't have the experience on how to model out the business. Going back to the USDA,
Yes.
is it safety or is it obstruction of innovation and entrepreneurship? What's going on there?
I think it's both. And that's such a dumb answer, but I wanna like really explore all of it. So at the end of the day, like I said before, Americans want to walk into a restaurant and know that if they have tartare, it's safe. They want to know that if they have, they go out, they purchase a new calabrese salumi from the newest niche brand, that it's going to be safe. They just want to spend their dollars with confidence because the dollars mean so much now. It's different than it was in 2018. We wanted to spend our dollars to have the greatest charcuterie board and the most perfect table setting. I think that was a really high time for meat. But now the economy is different. People really want confidence, and that's what it was like in the 90s too. So FSIS has been tasked, and FSIS being the Food Safety Inspection Service arm of the USDA, with creating a national and global supply chain of trustworthy, wholesome meat products. So as you can imagine, if you were in charge of that, you would likely take the most conservative approach always. And you would constantly be searching out, where are the loopholes? Where are people taking advantage? Where does the butcher have his thumb on the scale? Because there are those people, and one bad apple can spoil the bunch. But it's also a tremendously difficult program to run nationally. The belief is that prevention is the only way. Testing it's a dog and pony show. To prevent food outbreaks is the only way to ensure that trust. And so they really pull out all the stops. Now, in theory, great. We love that. However, you get what you pay for. And with an agency that's constantly defunded, and the labor pool is harder to attract, and the pay is low, and the work is very, very hard, I think it's really difficult to have a great program that we're proud of, that's collaborative, that doesn't feel like food cops. And this makes me think about Greg Gunthorpe in Illinois. I mean, this fella, Gunthorpe Family Farms is his organization. They're fantastic farmers. They own their own processing. They're highly, highly dedicated to quality. They're also very aware of science and probability. And I mean, Greg is a very learned guy. He's a wildly intelligent and well-read
Do they have a
person.
controller?
Oh, I'm sure. And
Yeah.
it could be Greg. I don't know, but he's the farmer, but he's also the compliance manager. So we get into this gray area of performance standards, where they're saying, you're going to bring this many birds through the plant, this many chickens are going to be processed, and this many, here's the bar for how many can come up with a sliver of a trace of salmonella or campylobacter. And if you go above this threshold, you're out of compliance. And now there's going to be a lot of expensive reviews on your plate. That's really oppressive, and it's a standard of excellence that the government is trying to hold people to, but it's very, very expensive.
Yeah, and it seems sometimes subjective. I mean, I think
Yeah.
it's hard. There are a lot of different variables in this industry, and it's hard to come up with a rule that fits everybody. You mentioned the folks who work in the industry and how challenging it is. What kinds of people apply for these jobs, and what's the training like?
It's a very good question. I'm just like pondering how do I be like very, very frank without ruffling feathers? Okay, so we're in a situation right now where, you know, wages are not rising with inflation. You could be a meat cutter in the 90s and put your kids through college and own a home.
Was that good of a
Very,
job?
I mean, yeah, I mean, very, people were in 1998, people were making $25 to $28 an hour as a meat cutter. In 2024, they're making $25 to $30 an hour as a meat cutter, but home prices have doubled or tripled,
Yeah.
And so we're in a tough spot right now because we're trying to attract talent, but it's hard. I mean, I was attracted to the industry because, to be totally honest with you, I loved working with my hands. I knew that, but I didn't know how. I love food. I love to eat. You could look at me and know that. And I knew that I wanted to be in the industry. But what really pushed me over the edge was like public and quality meats. It was Rob in Chicago with his butcher shop, who was doing the whole carcass breakdown. It was the craftsmanship. It was the mystery. It was the creation. It was the sexiness of the industry, and I think that that's run its course. I think that we've topped out there, and right now it's simply a, relatively mid-paying to low-paying manufacturing job.
Is there a psychological toll to doing this kind of work?
Oh yeah.
Talk to me a little bit about that.
So I think it depends on what department you're in. Slaughter's hard. I learned slaughter on farm in front of a USDA inspector with one trainer. And my first animal that I watched be killed was the first animal that I killed with my own hands.
Wow.
And the pressure was tremendously high. And I got a free pass because my inspector, it was a very small facility. Only 3 of us worked there. There was one inspector, and he treated it as a person-to-person relationship. And so there was a lot of leniency for learning. Nothing went wrong. I had a great trainer, Travis, my former co-host at the Meat Block, Travis Stockstill.
I didn't know Travis was your trainer. That's how you guys met?
He taught me. Well, we met because he delivered beef to my butcher shop that I was working at the time in Seattle. But he taught me how to kill beef. I already knew how to kill sheep and small ruminants, but he taught me beef.
Fantastic. Yeah. And then you guys had a podcast for several years. Give it a plug.
It's the Meat Block. You can go back and look at the archives from 2015 to 2022 ish, and hear you can hear the progression of Travis and I as professionals, and where I went from being a roughneck that just killed and cut to somebody who has to run businesses, and how the perspective changes. But ultimately, I think it's an approachable podcast that talks about the challenges of the industry and kind of lean. We talk a lot about mental health and
I mean, I feel like you guys were some of the first to chat about that, and that's what I wanted to ask was kind of, this is a job that happens behind closed doors. Yeah. And I mean, even if you're not in a kill facility, if you're not harvesting, even just processing meat, it's a very internal experience. When you watch people, they're engaging with each other, but most of the time they're super focused on exactly what they're doing. And it's a repetitive motion, and there's a lot of noise, or there's a lot of clothing on, or it's really cold. And so it's not the most social of experiences, I think, when you're doing the work. Has that been your experience?
Oh, it's so true. I mean, the rooms are loud. You've got saws, you've got air handling units that are tremendously loud. The kill floor is very loud. Yes, it is. It's an environment for people who love to work with their hands, who are motivated by measurable results, who are motivated by goals, who love to do work knowing that you're never going to see that it's done.
Right.
When the cooler's empty, something terrible is going on, right? In a meat processing plant, there's just, it just never ends. The pipeline is always as stuffed as the shipping dock. And so you're motivated by repetition, by being able to recess into the dark corners of your mind to ruminate throughout the day as you do these things. Teamwork, making beautiful products. Like these are the things. But that, a lot of places people are just showing up for they just want a paycheck.
Right.
And that's like totally great, right? Like do your work, do something that you know exactly what's expected of you every single day so you can go and have time for your kids and
How do
your
you
family.
maintain focus when you're in there? What do you
You
do personally?
you're talking to the wrong guy for that. Focus is clearly my conversation is really meandering. Focus is not my strong suit, but for to be completely honest with you, I think all brains are different. When I work for the university, when I work as a plant manager, and I'm sitting at a desk solving big problems, creating content, creating systems, focus is difficult for me. When I'm on a cut floor and I know that I have 12 beef to cut this day, and my job is this, it's the saw and it's breaking and it's keeping an eye on final package good quality. It's very easy for me to focus because I'm constantly moving. There's always a new problem to solve. I'm assessing. I mean, it's so wildly variable in a meat plant. If you were a person that is motivated by hard work, moving your body, if you love sweater weather all the time, which I do, I love my layers, right? And if you love being able to constantly strive to be better, meat processing's great. There's always a problem to solve every single moment of the entire day. And that's how I focus. Now, if you're working on a like, let's say the big plant in Toppenish, Washington, and your slaughter line is divided up into 87 different stations, and you're making one slice 2,000 times a day, that's a different story. And I think the mental toll on that is absolutely, it's huge. It's really, really difficult.
You've been on the line doing that. I mean, what would you do to stay focused in that situation? Like, do you listen to music? Do you think about, you're writing a story in your head? What are you doing?
There's music, there's competition between stations, that's a really big one, keeping up. They make it fast enough so that you don't really have time to think, so you're striving for greatness. But for me, it was always moving towards a station that had the most stuff to do. So I wanted to be the gutter and the splitter because I knew I was always going to have more than I could keep up with, which quickly led me to QC, because when you're a quality control technician, you're just like running from station to station, documenting everything. And I'm a busybody, but some people that I work with, they're very comfortable and they want to be thinking in their minds. They want that slow, I want one thing to focus on. I don't want to be bothered by a bunch of detail. I mean, there's something for everybody really in
Yeah.
the industry.
It's probably very meditative.
It is. Yeah, totally. Great way to put it.
Now, what about the social stigma? When you go to a party, people ask you what you do. Now, you're up there in Northern California. There's a lot of folks in the agricultural industry and a lot of folks in the meat industry. But let's say you come down to LA and somebody says, "Hey, what do you do for a living, David?" What do you say? And is there judgment? Are there challenges?
You're totally right. When I went to the Siskiyou County Cattlemen's annual dinner a couple of weeks ago,
You're a rock star there, probably.
I was very proud to be who I was and hand out business cards and talk to all the ranchers because they want to know that I'm here. We want to talk, and every rancher has a question for me. Why is processing so expensive? Tell me about margins. What, blah, blah, blah. I could talk all day about that stuff. But when I'm in Seattle visiting where I'm from and visiting new friends that I don't know, oftentimes in Seattle, it's either tech or healthcare. They say, "What do you do?" I say, "I work in agriculture." But, I think that you're right. There is such a public opinion on meat processing in general, especially after the pandemic, especially with Boar's Head and all of the sanitation violations with underage workers and all these different things. There's so much public opinion out there.
How do folks act differently now? Or is it about the same, like from 10 years ago to today? If you get down into the nitty gritty and you say, "Yeah, I'm actually in the processing side," are people curious? Do they want to learn more? Or is it get a little bit quiet?
I'm in a unique position because of the work that I do, because and also I'm just a gabber, so I have a lot of stuff to talk about that I like. But 15 years ago, it was a good time to be, you know, a young, tattooed, like guy or gal in the industry who was doing something that was cognitively dissonant and kind of fun and interesting.
Yeah, you were counterculture. You were a total hipster. And
Yep,
now,
totally.
now that's not the case.
No, no, no. It is absolutely not the case. And I would be curious to hear what's happening down at Standing Shop or at the Meat Hook or whatever, and hear what it's like now for retail butchers. But for me, my conversation is all about money.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was going to say. It comes down
Yeah,
to cost. We're back to your
yeah,
earlier point, which is there's been so much change in the business and in the larger economy that the discretionary income is harder and harder to come by, and
yes,
people are spending it on other things. And
yeah,
food is really struggling to continue to argue quality over price. And I'm hopeful that what's going to happen is, if we've got more people like Jill Saladin joining USDA, that kind of systemically there are some changes, because I do feel like more and more people that I talk to that 10 years ago had no interest in organic, regenerative, or knowing what the animals they were eating, now everybody's like, oh yeah, I want it to be healthy. They don't necessarily know what that means. And they may not spend a whole lot of time defining that, but there's a higher level of enthusiasm for quality, but certainly not going to buy a $65 a pound ribeye.
yeah, yeah. You're very good at this, Steve. I really appreciate the way you're prompting these, because you're so spot on.
Well, thank you. What should people look for when buying meat today then? If it's price,
Right.
how do we go to the grocery store and know we're getting something that's quality and responsibly raised?
So yes, you're right. It's all about cost, and the conversations that I have are really about, there's a huge distaste for big meat, and there's a lot of stories about small meat. And my job, or at least my personal mission, is to I'm here for truth. I just want truth, and I'm like that. It's not fun to be around me a lot in these conversations.
I like truth. I don't want it to be false. So big meat versus little meat, what do you mean? Define that a little bit more.
Big meat is like who's feeding the country today.
Right.
It's who's in Safeway, Kroger, Albertsons, Whole Foods Market. It's who is feeding everybody. And then there's niche meat, and that's those of us who are fortunate enough to be aware of the difference, or have the means to allocate financial resources and time resources.
And so there's those two, and you're working on the middle ground, which is kind of a hybrid between them.
Yeah, I'm like kind of forcing my way into this middle space where I think that there's some good things from both, where we need to find a way to meet in the middle. And I kind of think that that's just the general state of the country, but I don't want to devolve into politics, but
We're getting so political on it, laying down board today. I love it. This is great. Well, okay, so
yeah,
there's the big beef,
yep,
and then there's niche. So you're either going to Kroger's and you're getting it at the grocery store, and it just says prime, choice, or select, right? Those are the ratings. You don't know where this meat's coming from. It just says, maybe it says Angus, maybe it says natural. And then the other end of the spectrum, you could talk for 25 minutes to your butcher about where the hell this meat came from and what it ate and what its name was and where it lived and all that. What should people do if they don't want to go at the big end of the spectrum, and they can't afford the more niche end? Like, how do they get your middle meat industry? Where does that exist?
I don't, I just want to say, I don't think that I think there's a lot of food choice shaming in the industry. There's a lot of like altruistic, very like righteous people who are, kind of proselytizing niche meat and how it's the only way and it's the only responsible way. And like, I do appreciate that passion, but I just don't think it's realistic. I grew up an hour and a half north of Detroit, Michigan, and that area, it's actually more expensive for me to go buy food when I visit my family on the holiday at a conventional grocery store than it is for me to buy food at Whole Foods Market in Seattle.
Wow.
And so I'm not going to shame anybody for what they spend their money on because you got to eat. And really, really well-raised meat is a luxury today that I wish that everybody had access to. And that's why I spend so much time in the world of educating folks on cost accounting, activity-based costing, margins, supply chain management, standardizing the processes within their facility, because that's the only way to raise the margins to a degree that we can make niche meat affordable. We have to adopt some of these principles from bigger companies because they're not big because, well, most of them are not big because they started that way. They just figured out how to make it work. And so we, as the niche meat industry, can't just say, well, it's harder to do it and we worked harder and there's less of it and it's scarce, so it has to cost 10 times as much. Like I want to get out of that kind of black and white paradigm. I want to get into a place where we're making great food, but also employing strategic planning, financial hygiene, and kind of modern, cost accounting principles to make it accessible to more people. That's what I want.
Who's doing that at a scale that folks listening to this podcast could say, okay, rather than go to the farmer's market this week and, pay my paycheck to a farmer who's doing a great job to make a really quality steak, I just want to get some ground beef, or I need, a flank steak to make some stir fry this week. Where do I go? And are there folks on the horizon? It sounds as you're growing. I mean, you don't have to give specifics if you don't have them, but
Sure.
Is there hope for that? Are we seeing more access to that kind of meat that's somewhere in the middle?
Well, one of the many downfalls of like Belcampo, which there's so much to say there, but it was so idealized and bespoke and uncompromising in what they were advertising. There was no room to make it work.
Yeah.
And when I look at places that are operating right now in a way that personally, I'm going to hedge my bets that it's viable. We got a couple of places that really come to mind. You've got a place like Richard's Regenerative. I think that they have done a fantastic job of diversifying their business. So they still have the direct-to-consumer, wholes, halves, and quarters. They've got the more, the razor-thin margin, processed consumer packaged goods product that you can find. But to balance that, they also have direct-to-consumer online sales at a good margin, and it's not insanely expensive.
Yeah.
Like it's approachable, right? That's a price for meat that you can stomach. And then they also have other higher margin food service. So they've been able to scale their business to a degree, and they're by no means massive. I couldn't tell you what they slaughter a year, but they found a way after being in business for a long time. They figured out a way to really dive into cost accounting and understand how to balance their books in a way that allows them to offer meat to everybody. If you want your freezer beef, come and get a whole beef for $4 a pound. Then stock your freezer and have two chest freezers and do that. If you want to be shopping at Erewhon and you want to pay $50 a pound for a New York steak, you can do that. And they figured out a way to make it work. And it's because of how meticulously they plan and they track data, and the data tells them a story, and they make decisions. They are working on their business and not in it.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's a good point too for consumers is, we want that experience when we're looking for a quality product that, it's almost a high touch experience, which costs money. It's part of the margin, right? It's part of why your steak costs more per pound, is if you want to go into a butcher shop at a small scale and be, chatted with for 30 minutes about how to cook it and where it came from, versus working directly with a lot of these ranchers where they're, cutting out the middlemen. They're obviously paying a lot for marketing and making sure they've got a good website and shipping and all that, but buying in bulk, buying on the hoof, or in subprimals. And that's another one that I've found lately. I actually have finally become okay with Costco. And as long as there's packaging that tells me where the product is coming from, I feel, I mean, in this industry, there are a ton of ways that they put a name on a product that maybe it's not really the farm. So you got to do your homework. But I go around, I don't buy anything that week. If we're going to go to Costco to get our toilet paper or to get, our bulk items, and I'll look and see what they have. And then I'll do my research at home to find if I can track it down. And of course, I've got relationships in the industry, so it's a lot easier for me. But I'll buy a whole strip loin, or I'll buy a whole rib loin. It's an expensive purchase. It's, $150 or $200. There's 15 steaks in it, and I'll take it home and cut them up, and I'll get them for $10 a pound or $9 a pound versus, 16 or 18, whatever they're charging for them fabricated. So that's not difficult butchery. Like, most people can do that.
Yeah.
There's a great guy like Meat Dad. I don't know if you follow him on Instagram. He's got 1 million followers, literally. And he talks about some of these really basic skills, buying a grinder, doing, cutting the subprimals into fabricated cuts, all these kinds of things that seemed 10 years ago probably really difficult for people or inaccessible for the average consumer. But nowadays, you can buy a big cut like that, and as long as you've got a freezer, you can store it.
Sure.
Let's talk about Belcampo, because that, I think, is a fascinating thing. And for my listeners, Belcampo Meats opened in about, 2013?
12, 13.
Yeah. And they were a vertically integrated meat company. So this meant they were raising the beef up there around Mount Shasta. They had their own processing plant. So they were slaughtering, they were cutting and wrapping, and then they were sending the meat to their own retail locations, butcher shop to start with, and then restaurant. And then now and then 10 years later, they had locations in Northern California and Southern California and even in New York. And then suddenly something happened in 2021. There was a bit of a controversy. It just so happens David was at Belcampo during this controversy. So can you give us a little bit of a background and what happened?
Yeah. So I was the 5th plant director in like 3 years and had a really strong 2-year run where we made the plant profitable. We got everybody trained up. Everything was going really well. And then I left for reasons, and then, saw the whole thing kind of implode from a beautiful ranch in Washington. It was just like, holy smokes,
Yeah, you got to watch from a distance then. So how did it implode? What happened?
I think that there's like the impetus, there's the pin that was pulled from the grenade, and then there was like all of the powder that had been accumulating. Right. So the impetus was, from what I understand, a fellow that I don't know, a butcher there took an opportunity to expose some things, for whatever reason. He really wanted everyone to know what was going on. And it sounded like the butcher shops were ordering in low cost international beef and mislabeling it in the case as something else.
Right. And Belcampo, being a vertically integrated business model, its whole value proposition was that you were buying directly from the farmer, and it was their meat. But it sounded like what was happening was the growth on the retail side, especially on the restaurant side, was happening robustly. And then you were telling me, that earlier that year that there were some production challenges on the supply side. So your processing plant was having challenges. And so, butchers or managers of the individual retail stores were purchasing meat from the open market.
Yes.
Which, they probably could have messaged properly if they just said, hey, this
bingo,
same claims, maybe same geography, maybe different geography, but same program. This kind of meat is regenerative, it's organic, it's, corn and soy free or whatever, grass finished. But that didn't seem to be what happened. Like the guy, and again, I don't know him either, but and I think he's kind of disappeared, which is interesting. I think he had a company, like a meat stick company or
Oh,
something at one point, but yeah, he like, I don't know if he got picked up or what, but then he
huh.
went to ground again. So if you're out there and you want to talk, hey, come on Enlightened Omnivore. But he
Yep.
blew the whistle that there was not only other people's meat, but like commodity beef that was, feedlotted, and beef that had no claims on it, and that they probably got for dollars a pound, and then they were selling it for $40 a pound filet mignon in the case. And so he blew the whistle, and the walls came tumbling down.
I'm going to answer this in a way that's probably not great for, listenership, but it is what I think is honest. I want there to be this like deep state scandal of Belcampo where they're just ripping everyone off and just pocketing the money and running all the way to the bank. But it's just like not that cool. It's not that interesting, and here's why. Because yes, there were some people in the organization who made some very unscrupulous, uninformed, ego-based decisions. And that is very, very true. And some I don't know if any of those people have ever been held accountable. And at least one of them is making a resurgence in social media right now. So there is that, and I want to validate that. A lot of people that felt burned, that's true. There were people that were in that. Belcampo was a meat company started by Silicon Valley startup venture capitalists. So a lot of those decisions in the way they're made apply to a lot of industries, but meat's special. We know this. And that's not just because I'm biased. Meat is weird, right? It's a deconstruction manufacturing industry rather than a constructive manufacturing industry. It's incredibly difficult
Every day because it's refrigeration. So if you don't move it quickly, you're losing money just standing around.
Yeah. You know that intimately. And so there is that piece I want to validate, but there's also this other piece where like Belcampo actually had 500 employees that really, really cared. I still know a lot of these people that ran those butcher shops, like Paul Martinez down in LA. Paul really, really cared. He's a good guy and cares about people. He's a family man. He's a hard worker. He wanted to make stuff work. And so I think it's really complicated to unravel the bowl of spaghetti there. But what is true is that it's very likely that they had a very poor execution when it came to labeling and what was in the case. You go to a grocery store, you get the little plastic placard on the pin that sits in the front, tells you what it is. They did not prioritize excellence in those programs. They prioritized just getting the product out. And so all of these sloppy mistakes happened. I don't think that Belcampo was necessarily running some sort of scheme where they were trying to bilk people out of all this money. I actually have nothing to validate this because we were so siloed in that company, so siloed, which is terrible. You should never be that way in a vertically integrated company.
Did you ever get to go down to the retail operations?
I did often, which is why I feel like I can speak to that, because when I saw things that didn't make sense in the case, coming from a retail background, working for Whole Foods for many years, I was able to go to like Paul and say, Paul, what is up? The signs aren't there. I think we need to do an update. And he'd say, I'm hamstrung. I've put these requests in for months and months and months, and I can't get the people who make those decisions to spend the money on the accurate signage. So I have to get the product out. If I don't have a ribeye sticker on it, I'm out of compliance. And the only one that I have is this one. And it was messy. It was so messy. And it was just not managed well, right? And it was not, the accountability wasn't there, but the pressure was there. And it's a startup, right? So we're treating it like this burning platform of a software company, but it's an agriculture company, and that by nature is slow and intentional, right? So there were so many like kind of what I would say, just to be totally clear, boneheaded mistakes that you should be held accountable to. Your feet should be held to the fire for those. But I don't think that it was necessarily an evil company throughout. I think there were a couple of people who were willing to compromise quality and integrity over stakeholder satisfaction, but there weren't many of those. But those people made a lot of the decisions. So I think that there was a lot of sloppiness in the butcher shops, and I think that had they, to your point, correctly labeled, hey, we got this beautiful beef, and it costs this, and we offer New Zealand and Tasmanian and Australian beef at this price, and here's what it is. You can choose. There's enough people in that market to be able to drive both product lines, but there was something about ego, right? And that's the thing.
But how did commodity beef show up in the cold box? Like,
yes, so that's the part where I can't unify my theory of general Belcampo relativity with quantum Belcampo mechanics. Someone was making a choice. I was not part of the federal investigation. I don't know how that landed. I don't know who that person was. And if it was a person that was in charge of margins and just hoped they could get away with something, what I can say is that was not a company-wide directive. And as someone who feels like they put their heart and soul into that company and was burned bad, I will still say that I don't think that it was a company-wide directive and that Todd Robinson would not stand for that. I do think that there was enough of a lack of financial accountability and education and management that it would be possible for someone to make that choice and go undetected. That makes sense.
And I think, I could see how a mislabeling or, a lot of these products are coming in boxes, and sometimes the boxes get swapped. And that kind of thing happens.
Sure.
I had the Wagyu product over here and you're selling it for, select prices or something like that, where you're selling it for a cheaper amount per pound. But I find it fascinating that they even had product that didn't meet their own guidelines in the store. And I'm sure that there was a reason for it. I think you're right that it wasn't like some massive conspiracy, because quite honestly, it wasn't pervasive enough across the organization. Although who knows what they were using for ground beef. That might have been even harder to manage. But it just seems really, it's disappointing when you see an organization that had such potential and had such a great story and lots of funding to vertically integrate, which is kind of the holy grail of regenerative agriculture, from cradle to grave, from ranch to table. You could have this model, and it just spectacularly failed.
Yeah.
Within weeks of the scandal, when this guy blew the whistle, the company kind of fell apart. Have you been in touch with anyone since then? And you mentioned the investigation. Like, what happened behind the scenes?
Yeah, good question. So when I showed back up to the plant in July of 2024, I found out that my crew was basically the same.
Yes.
And
I didn't know this until we just started talking today, but you're right back where you were when this all happened, or just before it happened. You're at the same facility that Campo owned.
It's a tremendous opportunity to do things differently, right? And so I'll not go on that tangential sort of, but I will say, okay, so your question was like, how did that happen? You mentioned vertical integration being the holy grail of regen ag, and what I would say to start that is, I think that if you are so blinded by your marketing plan and it's not married with your operations plan, this will always happen. This is exactly what we've been talking about in this conversation, that small processors have to adopt painfully, right? Because most small processor owners are agriculturalists, they're farmers, they are game processors. These are not people that come from manufacturing. I don't want to make it not fun, but we have to adopt these principles of business to keep going, because we're in this weird pubescent phase where we've like been processing deer seasonally and doing custom cut and wrapped in paper for so long. And now the consumer expects CPG level quality at every single turn. Farmers market, buying it out of the back of a Toyota Corolla in a parking lot, it doesn't matter. They want a 28-day shelf life and roll stock packaging. So there's a lot to talk about there.
Sure, but to be fair, like Belcampo was not that even from the beginning.
True.
I mean,
True.
Belcampo was well funded. It was, like you said, kind of Silicon Valley inspired. It had great people working at it at different levels of the organization. Yep. What happened after the whistleblowing? I mean, did you have visibility to that? Did you know what was going on?
So I knew, yes, I did, for several reasons. Partially because people in the company trusted me, and I trusted them, and so they kind of reached out for advice. What should I do? What's happening? What does this mean? And I also was, I was a witness. I had a responsibility. I had a civic responsibility to be truthful. And so that's all that I knew, though. I don't know what actually happened. And there was a lot going on. I know they have class action lawsuits regarding employment practices. They had so many things.
Were you questioned? Were you part of an investigation?
Yeah.
And was that like civil lawyers, or was it an actual legal investigation?
No, that was a federal prosecutor.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Yeah. I had no idea.
And so I had to be very forthcoming, and I had to be very, very clear. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah. Yeah. And so vertical integration is great. I think that it can work. However, I think that producer-owned processing is very, very complex and very volatile, and it's not the simple model that people think it is. So I think that one of the many things that Belcampo did wrong is that they tried to vertically integrate, and they prioritized owning everything over letting people do their best work. And so, in my opinion, I'm actually not a huge advocate of vertical integration. I am a huge advocate of partner farm and cooperatives. And when I say cooperative, I don't necessarily mean that in like the traditional fiduciary structure sense. I mean that in a specialization sense. So you take somebody like Cody Hopkins at Grassroots Cooperative in Arkansas, or you take Walden Local Meats in the East Coast. Or you take somebody like Richards or Stemple, who are employing partner farms. Belcampo tried to do that.
So what are partner farms?
So the idea is, the big idea is we're all doing everything. You're trying to market your own meat and raise it and schedule processing and sell it and inventory it. And the costs to do that in your own company are extremely high. What I can do as a meat brand is let you raise the beef. I'm going to pay you a very fair price, above market price, or above commodity price. And then I've got a marketer, I've got a salesperson, I've got a processor that I trust very much that does things to my spec, and I co-invest with them. I have a cooperative relationship with my processor, and everybody is doing exactly what they love to do and what they do best, and everyone is making a larger margin because they're not wasting time on things that they do poorly. And so it's vertical integration, but it's a collaborative version rather than we're going to do it ourselves because we have to take control of quality. And they're both, I think you could call them both vertically integrated, but I think that they're different. And I think that's where we got it wrong.
Yeah. And I mean, I totally respect that. I think there's challenges with every model, and the vertical integration model is inefficient until it's to scale.
Yeah.
And then when it gets to scale, people are like, well, how is this different from
It's Tyson?
Yeah, exactly. Now you're Tyson. So So I get that sense, but I think the big issue with doing it in a more, you called it a partner ranch or partner partner model,
Partner farm, partner
partner
processor. Yeah.
farm
Yeah.
model
Yeah.
where, where you've got several, you're a meat packing plant and you work with several ranchers and you're maintaining quality and consistency and you're getting it from multiple sources. That sounds great, but then there's no transparency to the
Hmm.
consumer.
Hmm.
So how do we create that consumer transparency, that third party audit, that person who's watching just to make sure when things speed up or when there are the perfect storm of issues, the integrity of the product remains.
Yeah.
Is that the regenerative certification process? Is that organic? Is there a need for that? Something new? You talked about gap earlier as well. Like, how do we keep ranchers, I won't say honest, but how do we protect them from shortcuts or mistakes or inconsistencies?
Very good question.
I've stumped David.
Well, it's so big. It's so big. And this is the juice, right? This is what I love is diving into this mess. So I think I would probably say that to date, the closest thing to a perfect answer is Purdue or Tyson.
Interesting.
However, those are fraught with a totally different set of issues, right? From a business standpoint, they run well. From a stakeholder profitability and animal welfare and cost controlling standpoint, it's highly problematic. So this is where I want to like really lean into the question that I'm answering.
Well, how is that? Are they transparent? Like, I feel like those companies are just a big black box to
You're
me.
right. You're right.
And to be fair, I actually have a friend who we used to buy from was
Mhm.
purchased by Purdue, and they're doing, it sounds like a fantastic job of scaling this really cool chicken tractoring concept. They've got this like 250,000 bird ark, like this, basically greenhouse on wheels that robotically moves across Kansas, is single-handedly regenerating soil across, the GMO capital of the world. But I mean, that sounds great, but is it real? And how do we, I mean, big corporations, I've worked with a lot of them, they don't like to share because they always get beat up on, no matter, they don't win either way. They're damned if they do, they're damned if they don't. And there's big dollars at risk. So is there another way to require transparency? And what would you tell Joel Salatin that he's got to do in terms of transparency with the USDA to get, more credibility to this marketplace?
I definitely have a list of things that I would share with Mr. Salatin that I think he could do differently. My biggest bone to pick with Joel is just like, show me the money. Show me how it pencils out. Get a CFO on your side and show me how, yes, you're right. Your model sounds awesome and we all love it and we all want to throw money at it, but show me that it's sustainable. That's all I want.
Sure.
You
I mean,
know,
can we make transparency pencil out? Like, third-party audit, is it that expensive to do?
no, it's not. I think transparency is just it just slows things down. It's just that Americans have to decide what they want to spend their money on. And again, this is it feels like a landmine because I don't want to get into the situation where I'm saying like, well, buy a Razor flip phone and spend more money on meat because it's just like I can't decide that for people.
Right.
It's just not realistic. There are a lot of people that step up on that platform, and that's just not me. But I think the transparency is possible. But in order to free the funds to make transparency and vertical integration and paying partner farms great wages so that everybody can just do the work they want to do, let the marketers market. They love that shit. Let the salespeople sell. They love it. It's weird, but let them do it. That's my perpetual adversarial relationships with salespeople. As an operations person,
I can't imagine a sales guy wanting to be in a processing plant all day long.
No,
So
they
I
don't.
think it's there's, you're self-selecting. You're in the right spot. So
Yeah.
don't worry about it.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, this is where I think where you're going is like transparency and third-party audit does not pencil out for the individual company. But you mentioned, in the 90s when people were getting E. coli from undercooked hamburger, like government stepped in. And, the point is that transparency really is that public trust, and it's got to be an independent review. And you can't be paying people to audit your product and tell you it's bad. Like, that's never going to work. The incentives are all wrong there. So is it really more an issue of policy redirecting the focus of the USDA from large scale, high volume, efficient models to this more middle scale with a higher concern on transparency and accountability to the individual farmer, so we can market these products like the farmer's market and still get the benefits of scale so that we reduce the cost to the consumer, but they can know that this absolutely came from the United States and it absolutely came from this region and it absolutely was fed this ration, and maybe even that it sequestered this much carbon because of all of the soil rebuilding it's done. Like I feel like we can get there, but there isn't enough motivation on the policy front. Every time I talk to a rancher, I say it's a policy issue, and maybe I'm biased, but this is a policy issue. They're like, well, anything to do with policy. Like, I just want to go back to raising beef. I'm like, yeah, I get it. But should government get involved in transparency? And two, are there currently projects or initiatives going on to do that?
Ooh. Yeah, good question. I want to believe that the market will police itself. However, I think that was true in the 90s and in the early 2000s up until 2007. And now the nationwide financial situation is such that people just have to pay attention to other things. So some of us like really care about transparency, and also like I'm in the industry, and like when I go to the farmer's market, I actually don't want to scan a QR code on my package of chicken to know what pasture it came from, because like I know farmers and I know that these are not dishonest people, and I know that they want to do a good job and their product is wildly important to them. So I'm actually not that worried, but I do think that there is some space for that elsewhere to kind of like build that muscle in people. I don't think that the government will do a good job of implementing let's say there was like a new Traceability Modernization Act, and it acted much like the Federal Meat Inspection Act in '96. I don't think that we would be effective, because I think it's so hard. Well, rather, it's so easy to fudge it if you want to.
Yeah, no, I get that.
I don't. But however, the government is they're pretty interested in traceability. I mean, like I have to have pretty robust, record keeping practices. But I think that from the consumer perspective, we're like, I want to know where this beef came from. Is it from the U.S.? Who raised it? How was it fed? What's it like? I don't think the government can do a good job at that. I wish that the market could police itself. I don't think that it can, because it's so easy to market yourself and greenwash yourself at such a high level. There's so many farmers that don't even know they're doing it. I mean, how many times do you go to the farmer's market and there's like a sign out that says regenerative agriculture beyond organic,
right?
And like every Tom and Jane that puts a beef on their backyard and has it shit on the grass thinks it's regenerative. Like there's no real definition of what that means. And regenerative should be everywhere from the top line to the bottom line and everything between, not just rebuilding soil. And so I don't think the government should get involved, because I think that it's a trap. I think they won't get it perfect. Everybody will scrutinize it, and then it'll be another issue with the government. But I do think that when we're not vertically integrated in the possession model, but we're vertically integrated in the skills model, and you've got checks and balances, and you've got people who are dedicated to quality first. And I define quality as a conformance to specification. So we've said, here's our target customer, here's what we're making, here's what it looks like, here's what's non-negotiable. It's this every time. I think that when you have a quality first vertical integration, you've got enough checks and balances that traceability is relatively easy because the costs are spread throughout the system.
Well, I'm willing to argue later whether or not government should get involved. And in general, I tend to be a small government guy, but I feel like when there's issues like this, that there isn't an easy way to make money at it.
Sure.
And to ethically maintain the motives.
Yeah.
Where do you go? And I've seen a couple of models in other countries. I know that Australia is doing some work there, and but anyway, it has been fascinating to talk to you, and I just feel like we're really only have scratched the surface.
Yeah, me too.
The industry, and I'll probably get a ton of questions from listeners who want to know more about what you do day to day. But David, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your perspective. I hope you come back soon. And yeah, I mean, just keep on the good fight, because I feel like we need more guys like you out there doing this work.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks for having me. I appreciate reconnecting, and I hope that I think we both have changed over the years and have really weathered a lot, in the industry, and that our opinions and positions have changed. But I think we still have the same mission, which is pretty exciting. I'm really glad you're doing this, and I really appreciate you having me on, and would love to do more of a deep dive whenever you're up for it.
Fantastic. Great talking to you today. And everybody out there, remember, folks like David are in those big buildings with no windows, trying to keep your meat safe and delicious, doing hard work, and really bringing what I think is maybe the next generation of artisanal meat is going to be this middle meat industry. I'm excited about that. Thanks for coming on, David. Take care. And that wraps up another episode of Enlightened Omnivore. A special thanks to all my subscribers for listening this week. You can all read more about everything omnivorous on my weekly Substack newsletter found at enlightenedomnivore.substack.com. Join me next month as we continue to uncover the stories behind our food and the new ways we can live sustainably together. Thank you for tuning in. This is Steve Sabaker reminding you to savor every bite and eat mindfully. Until next time, keep it balanced and stay enlightened.